This is the second chapter of this book about Nelly. Chapter 2, The Priest's Curse. Now, I want to say this before I get to reading this. This is not a slam against the Catholic Church that I am reading this. This book is of historic value. All denominations have gone through periods of ups and downs, and this period between 1800 and 1850 was a period of time when the Catholic Church was going through some change. Anyway, here is the second chapter, The Priest's Curse. Early the next forenoon, when Nelly was laying out her mother's clothes, preparatory to helping her to dress, they were surprised by a visit from Father Philip. The widow, astonished and flurried, scarcely knew whether to be most pleased by such an honor or vexed to be found in bed and unprepared to receive him with proper respect. Nelly, having placed a chair for him with all proper reverence, took up Allie and ran with him into a neighboring cottage, lest, as she said, he might not be behaving himself before his reverence. She had to stay for a minute to explain to the neighbor why Allie was given into her charge. She had also to run up the brae behind the cottage, and there's that word brae. You might want to look it up. It's an old Scottish word. To where the older boys and little Betsy were playing, in order to warn them that they must not come in to make a noise until the priest went away. And then she hastened back, half afraid that Father Philip might come upon the dangerous subject of the masses for her father's soul, and might even persuade her mother to part with Tony's £2. And her fears were not groundless. Father Philip had been lately present at a meeting of Roman Catholic priests, and had been in pretty plain terms admonished that his zeal for the welfare of the church was suspected to be somewhat cold, and particularly that less revenue was derived from his parish than from any other of equal size in the kingdom. Stung by these reproaches and taunts, he returned home with the firm resolution to be henceforth more strict with his parishioners, and by the large amount of contributions he should exact from them, to prove to his brethren the injustice of their accusations. At John's funeral, he heard the neighbors conversing about the circumstances of the family, and the small sum in the bank having been mentioned. He had come to see the widow with the express purpose of extorting from her a goodly proportion of her supposed wealth for masses for her husband's soul. The fact of John's having died without confession was a fair ground to work upon in exciting her fears for his safety, and when Nelly returned, she found her mother listening with a face full of misery to the priest's artfully drawn pictures of the horrors of purgatory. "But oh, your reverence, what can I do?" cried the poor woman. "I'd think no penance too hard, no pilgrimage too great. I'll do anything to save my dear, dear husband, if you'll only tell me what." "I hope, Mrs. McLean," was the priest's somewhat stern answer, "that you are not ignorant of the means our Holy Mother Church mercifully provides for this end." "By masses, you mean? But oh, your reverence, I've no money to pay for them, she replied in a faltering tone of deep anxiety. No money, Mrs. McLean? He asked, still more sternly. A very few shillings is all I have, and I'll give every penny of it gladly, joyfully, but it is so little. And you are sure a few shillings is all you possess? He asked again, looking keenly at her. All except 2 pounds we owe Tony of the Bray, she answered despairingly. It is quite right to pay your debts, but your debts to the Holy Church ought to be the first thought. Pay these 2 pounds for masses now, and let Tony wait till you can make up your debt to him. Surely he can wait better than your poor husband can in the fires of purgatory, he added solemnly. Nelly looked anxiously at her mother. She thought she seemed inclined to yield, and she exclaimed eagerly, But, your reverence, that money is not ours. Father promised to pay it as soon as he drew it from the bank. That money is Tony's. Indeed, it is not ours. The priest looked at her in indignant surprise and sternly asked what she knew about the matter, that she should presume to interfere. I know, said Nelly with spirit, that money is Tony's, and I know the Lord has said, I love not robbery for burnt offering. And who are you that presume to teach me? He demanded furiously. Who dare to take the holy word into your mouth? I don't wish to teach you, sir, said Nelly simply and more humbly. I only wish to tell you the reason why we think it right to keep this money for Tony. Father made me promise to pay it to him, and he said he did not need masses for... Oh, I see it all now, cried the priest furiously. I see now why he was content to die without confession. Woman, your husband was a wretched heretic, but I bid ye think where he is now. I bid ye ask yourself if he will now think he needs no masses. Can you not hear his voice entreating you to save him from his torments? And can you hear that voice without pity? Can you think without shuddering on his present state? Hush, man, cruel. Hush, hush, man, cruel, heartless that ye are, cried Nelly in great agitation. Prudence and respect all forgotten in pity for her mother and indignation against the priest. How dare ye add sorrow to the full heart? If you really believe it is with my father, as you say, you might surely do what you can to save him without waiting for a miserable bribe of money. That a poor 2 pounds should be put against a man's soul? Mother, dear mother, you cannot believe it. The priest rose hastily, glared upon her for a minute in speechless anger, and then burst forth with a torrent of bitter curses and denunciations. When he had exhausted his store of imprecations, he strode out of the room without casting a look upon the poor trembling woman. He paused at the threshold, and lifting up both hands exclaimed, My curse, the curse of our Holy Mother Church, be upon the house and all it contains, so long as it harbors that cursed heretic, the miserable destroyer of her father's soil, the vile agent of Satan, the blasphemous blaspheming enemy of God. Mrs. McLean had started up in bed and looked after him with a face full of horror. She tried to speak, but could not, and when she heard the door close after him, she sank back upon her pillow with a groan of utter wretchedness. Mother, Dear mother, never mind him, cried Nelly, kneeling by her bedside. Don't think the Lord will listen to his curse. Bad, cruel man that he is. Dear mother, don't look so wild. Speak to me, mother. Oh, mother, look at me. Don't stare in that way, she continued, terrified at the vacant look of despair in her mother's face. But Mrs. McLean did not seem to hear her. She lay quite still, her eyes fixed on the roof of the bed with a look of horror and misery. Mother, mother, cried poor Nelly. He knows nothing. Never mind what he says. Don't be afraid of the curse of such a wicked, heartless... Hush, hush, cried the mother wildly again, starting up. Don't speak such wicked words. Have you not done mischief enough already? Burn, burn, you've broken your mother's heart and ruined your father's soul. Oh, John, John, darling of my heart, joy of my life, that I should live to hear that said of you, and I not able to help you, able to do nothing for you. And she called wildly to the priest to come back and take off his curse, promising to do anything, everything he could wish, if he would but bless her poor husband, promising that her life should be one continued penance, if that could do any good, or that she should toil night and day for money to pay him, if he would only say masses for her dearest John. She took no notice of poor Nelly's tears and entreaties of that she would lie down and be quiet, but went on incessantly with her wild, incoherent lamentations, tossing her arms above her head, wringing her hands, rocking herself to and fro, while deep shuddering sobs shook her whole body. Nelly grew more and more frightened and knew not what to do. She was afraid to leave her to call for assistance, and was, besides, unwilling that their neighbors should hear her father so spoken of. Oh, if Miss Helen would but come! A step was heard on the threshold. The latch was lifted. Could it be Miss Helen? No, but it was the person who next to her was the most welcome visitor Nelly would have had. It was a very good old woman who lived a little distance from them. She was a solitary woman, all her family being married, and she had been of much use to the McLeans during John's illness, often sitting up with him at night, when his poor wife was worn out, taking the younger children away to keep the house quiet, washing their clothes, and such kind offices. She was one of the Mr. McNeil's congregation, so that Nelly could confide to her the cause of her mother's distress more easily than she could have done to any of her papist neighbors. Mrs. McLean seemed quite unconscious of old Nanny's presence. She did not hear, or at least did not heed, what she said to her, but went on with her wild talking and gestures as before. She's almost out of her mind, Nelly. If we could get something to give her that might quiet her a little, so that she would hear a body speak. Have you any of that fine draught Mr. McNeil used to send your father? You mind it, how it used to quiet him when he was restless. Yes, the bottle had been filled the very day her father had died, and Nelly ran to fetch it. It was not for some time, however, not till she was completely worn out with her own vehemence, that they could persuade Mrs. McLean to take it. But when she had done so, the effect was even more immediate and powerful than they had expected. John had taken it for a long while, and Mr. McNeil had several times increased the quantity of the opiate it contained, as the former strength began to lose its effect. so that it was now much stronger than it ought to have been given to one wholly unused to take opiates of any kind. Neither Nelly nor old Nanny were at all aware of this, and they rejoiced greatly to see the poor widow's sobs cease, and she fall into a sound, heavy sleep. Old Nanny remained with Nelly for some time, and heard from her more particularly all that had passed. She confirmed Nelly in her hope that the priest's curse could do no harm, and in her belief, which was ever becoming stronger and more cheering, that her father's soul was happy in the presence of his blessed Savior, to whom he had committed it, and that purgatory was but an idle tale. In truth, the priest's violence and avaricious desire for the money had opened Nelly's eyes more than anything else had ever done, and she had already formed the determination to leave Father Philip's religion, as she called it, and to get all together and to take to Miss Helen's. When Nancy had given Nelly all the comfort she could, seeing that Mrs. McLean was likely to sleep quietly for some time, she rose to go, saying that she would take the children home for the rest of the day and bring them back in the evening, when she could see how the poor woman was, and remain with her all night, if it was necessary. Nelly, afraid lest her mother's fears about purgatory might induce her afterwards to part with Tony's money, begged old Nanny to take it to him, so that all temptations might be taken away. "Mother bid me to take it the first thing today, and as I cannot leave her, will you do it for me?" Nanny willingly agreed and went away, leaving Nelly to sit quietly by her mother's bedside until she awoke. Miss McNeil had taught Nelly both to sew and knit very well. She had always full employment of that kind in making and mending the clothes of the family, for her mother was an indifferent workwoman. She had always been an active little girl who liked to be very busy about something or other, and Miss McNeil had taken great pains to teach her to be industrious and helpful to her mother from principle, and she had become more industrious and useful. Mrs. McLean had become more indolent and helpless, so that even before her father's death, the management and work of the little household had been left in her willing hands. And now, as she sat working by her mother's bedside, her thoughts were as busy as her fingers, planning how they were to live now that her father was gone, and how she could earn enough to support them all. She had counted the money left when she paid out Tony's £2, and there were only a few shillings, but then her half-year's rent was paid, and they had a fine store of potatoes, a considerable quantity of oatmeal, and a large stack of peats, so that want would be kept from them for a time at least. They had a very good garden, and Sam, her eldest brother, was now getting a big boy. He and she thought, could keep it all right with them, between them. They had a cow, which grazed in the wild brae near, without costing them anything, and she was to calve in a few months, and then they would have her calf to sell. The garden, the cow, and the pig would keep them in food, she hoped, and she must earn the rent by her labor. Nelly was not dismayed at this prospect. She was willing to work hard, and was not much afraid of wanting employment. The laird, it is true, was an absentee, and there was no rich family in the neighborhood to give work or help to the poor. But there were several farmers who had large farms and were, as the country people say, well-to-do. Her father had been a great favorite with them all, and she felt sure that both they and their wives would, for his sake, gladly help her in any way they could. Sometimes extra help was needed in the house upon the occasion of a large washing, a house cleaning, a sheet making, or some such press of work, and Nelly was so well known as a clever, handy, as well as industrious girl that she was almost sure of being the first to be chosen for such services. Some of the lighter kinds of field labor she could quite well undertake, and could look forward to earning occasionally a few shillings in that way. Perhaps she might even be engaged as a shearer next harvest. Old Nanny said she was a wonderful shearer for her age, and as some parts of each farm lay in well-sheltered valleys, where the grain was ripe before the shearers who had gone to the lowland harvest could return home, there was generally a great want of hands, and any of the farmers would be willing to engage her, young as she was. At any rate, if they could get on till harvest, they would do finely then. All the children could glean. Little Betsy could generally earn her own dinner and supper by looking after one or two little children while their mothers were shearing. Though only 7 years old, she was a steady, pleasant-tempered little lassie, and was quite contented to sit for hours at a time, amusing either her own Allie or a neighbor's child with making garlands of flowers, singing songs, or playing at Bo Peep. Then Mrs. McLean was well paid by those mothers who went to the lowlands for taking care of their younger children during their absence. In short, harvest time was a busy and a happy time for each and all. Besides these more regular employments, there were a few chance ways of earning money. Sometimes a trustworthy messenger was required to go to the nearest town, 10 miles off, and Nelly was proudly conscious that she was considered perfectly trustworthy. Sometimes Mrs. McNeil or some of the farmers' wives took a fancy to make preserves of brambles or blue, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Blaeberries, blaeberries. I looked it up, and those are bilberries. And Nelly and her little brothers were well paid for all they could gather. Then Miss Helen had taught her a new and superior mode of making rushlights. Did you look that one up? Rushlights. That was back when they didn't have any electricity, so they used rushlights. And she could find a ready sale for as many as she could make. And Nelly's heart filled with gratitude and joy as one after another of these various resources came to her mind. And with her simple earnestness she thanked her loving Father in heaven who had given her so many ways of helping her mother. She had full time for such thoughts, full time to feel first surprise and then alarm at the length of Mrs. McLean's sleep. It was not until late in the afternoon that she succeeded in rousing her enough to persuade her to take some food, and as soon as she had swallowed what Nelly gave her, she fell again into a heavy sleep. She was awakened a second time in the evening by the children coming home with Nancy, but she looked stupid and confused and complained of headache and sickness, so that both Nancy and Nelly began to fear they had done wrong in giving her the draught. She awoke on the following morning, however, apparently as well as usual, was able to get up to go about the house and to return to all her old habits and occupations. But, though apparently well in body, she was not so in mind. A settled melancholy had come upon her. She never spoke even to Nelly of her husband's death or of the priest's visit, but a constant expression of misery, almost of despair, told how much these things filled her mind. She seemed to have lost all interest even in her children, and expressed neither hope nor fear when Nelly repeated to her all the plans she had laid for the future. Nelly saw, therefore, that everything depended upon herself, that she must both arrange and carry out all measures for the good of the family. The first thing to be done was to find out how much assistance she could depend upon getting from those to whom she looked for work, and accordingly she set off one morning about a fortnight after her father's death to make a long round to all the farms to make known her wishes and ask what likelihood there was of success. But here poor Nelly was to meet with a bitter disappointment. Instead of the kindly looks, the warm welcome she had expected and had until now always met with, one looked coldly and shyly upon her. Another seemed distressed and confused. None would promise work, and at last one more blunt than the rest told her plainly that they could do nothing for her, that the priest had made round all the neighborhood and had forbidden every one to give her or her family any assistance. Boy, what a nice guy. Had Nelly not been so occupied with her home concerns, she might have been prepared for this. She might have seen coldness and embarrassment in the manners of the neighbors towards her, might have observed that few came now to see her mother, that few now stopped her when she met or passed them on the road, as they had been used to ask for her mother, or to say some kind, encouraging word. But she had been too busy to notice this, and the shock was now all the greater. She quietly thanked her informant for her plain dealing, and then wished a sad and utterly downcast heart. With a sad and utterly downcast heart, she took her way homeward. What could she do? How was she to support the family? The McNeils could not help her. They were poor themselves, and had already too many claims upon them. There was not a single human creature to whom she could look. Must her dear mother and the children starve, and she not be able to help them? And as the picture of want and misery rose before her mind, her courage failed altogether. She sat down upon the bank and gave way to a bitter fit of crying. But crying will do no good, she suddenly exclaimed, checking her sobs and drying her eyes. And what will do good? There was no one to help us. No one, no one. But then she remembered that although there was no earthly friend to help, yet they had a Father in heaven, all willing, all seeing, all powerful, and she lifted up her heart in prayer to him, that he would give her grace to trust him as her shepherd, who would teach, lead, and support her in all difficulties. And the precious words, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows," came to her mind, and comforted and strengthened, she rose and went on her way. Her day's work had been got through much sooner than she had expected. There had been no pressing invitation to sit down and rest, to stay and get dinner, or to wait until some little dainty could be got ready for her to take home to her mother. All her visits had been so very short, and one advantage was that she had now time to go to the manse, to tell all her difficulties to her kind Miss Helen, and to get from her encouragement and advice as to her future plans. That word manse, I looked it up. I think it's like a house for the Presbyterian minister, but you can look that up. I believe it's an old Scottish term. Sympathy Tender and full she at once received, but advice and encouragement were more difficult to give. Much as they desired to help her, none of the family at the manse could see any present way of doing so. "Has your mother no friends elsewhere, Nelly?" to ask Mr. McNeil after a long and fruitless discussion. "She has an aunt in Edinburgh," said Nelly. "But, oh, sir, we cannot leave home. We could never go away from you all. And leave our own bonny hills to live in Edinburgh? It would break mother's heart." And Nelly's own seemed full at the very thought, and as she turned hastily away to hide her tears, her kind friends felt deeply for her all the pain they knew such a plan must cause. But they could see no chance of poor Nelly's being able to stand against the opposition of the enraged priest. The neighbors had shown already how completely they were under his influence, and how the dread of offending him had triumphed over their kindly feelings of pity for the poor widow and fatherless, and over their own affection for them. And without employment, how could they gain a livelihood? They represented the matter to Nelly in its strongest light, and encouraged her to trust in the Lord, to look to him for comfort and countenance in a strange land. And there they succeeded in reconciling her in some measure to the project. But how could she ever get her mother to consent to leave the house where she had lived with the husband who was now gone, to leave the friends who had loved and known him, and the grave where his body was laid? It seemed impossible that this could even be done. Nelly had not the least hope that anyone could accomplish it. But she was mistaken. Mrs. McLean's mind was constantly filled with the fearful images the priest had presented to it, with terrible fears about her husband's state, and a restless desire to escape from all that could recall his image. Or these thoughts made her at once seize upon the proposed plan. The aunt was written to and answered kindly. She could get them a house at a reasonable rent, and hoped to get them work if they were only willing to be industrious. Their rent had been paid until Whitsunday. Look that one up, Whitsunday. And with occasional help from the manse and from friends whom the McNeils had interested in their case, they contrived to keep themselves in tolerable comfort until then. And long before that, Nelly was reconciled, nay, eager to go. The coldness of old and well-loved friends was a bitter trial, and one which could not be removed, even by the increased kindness of the McNeils and of their neighbors who belonged to the Protestant church. And her mother's restlessness increased to such a degree that she felt glad when the time of their departure came, and when the last sad partings were over. It was not without much anxiety that the McNeils bade them goodbye. They saw far more clearly than Nelly did how utterly useless Mrs. McLean had become, how entirely the welfare of the whole family depended upon Nelly, and she a girl little more than 14. They knew better than she did the great difficulty of getting employment in such a town as Edinburgh, and the difference between the expense of living there and in the Highlands. The aunt promised fairly, but perhaps might be unable, though willing, to keep her promises. They had written to the very few friends they had in Edinburgh to interest them in behalf of the McLeans, but they knew these friends had already more claims upon them than they were able to satisfy. Still, no better plan presented itself, and they could not remain where they were. In spiritual as well as in temporal matters, Miss McLean was anxious about her young favorite. Since the priest's visit, Nelly had openly and decidedly declared herself a Protestant. She had obtained a Bible, read it earnestly and regularly, delighted in it with her whole heart, and had learned to apply its precepts and its promises to her own circumstances. With singular correctness and a touching simplicity, she realized in a striking degree the constant presence and care of her Heavenly Father, rejoiced in this sense of her presence, trusted to Him fully, and endeavored earnestly to please and serve Him. But in one so loving, so quick to feel every kindness, so grateful for it, all this might well be, and still she might not be really, savingly united to Christ. She might have knowledge of sin, no belief in her own sinfulness, and no sense of her need of Christ as a Savior, to stand between her and God's just wrath on account of sin. Her love, her gratitude, her delight in God might all proceed from merely natural feelings, because she had learned to believe that He loved her, cared for her, and watched over her, because all the beautiful images of His tenderness and love contained in the Bible had excited in her heart a natural love and admiration for Him. And Miss McNeil sometimes thought that this was all Nelly had yet learned, and now she was going away among strangers where there might be no one to take any interest in her spiritual welfare, or, what would be far worse, where she might meet with injudicious Christians, who, delighted with the fair promise her character gave and with the picturesque simplicity of her religious belief, might flatter her that all was well and keep her further than ever from the right road. But there was no help. They must go, and the kind friends they left would only pray that the all-wise, all-good Lord would Himself guide and teach them. And that is the end of chapter 3, or chapter 2, and you notice here chapter 3 then is Nelly in Trouble. So that's the end of chapter 2 of this book, and I hope you are enjoying it. If you want to read on with this book, you can actually download it on Google, and I think I put those instructions in the first video. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.